As the global leader in choline, Balchem has spent more than 50 years perfecting the art and science of choline chloride production. The new Puricol line delivers the highest standards of quality, produced in state-of-the-art manufacturing facilities, and backed by the strictest process controls for a level of purity, safety, and consistency you can't find anywhere else. Turn to Puricol choline chloride from Balchem for an unmatched level of quality you can trust. Visit balchemanh.com to learn more. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Kim Jones, part of the marketing team here at Balchem. And this spring has been very difficult across the country as we've battled highly pathogenic avian influenza. As of June 17th, the USDA reports HPAI in 36 states, affecting over 40 million birds, and the economic impact has been significant. For today's Real Science webinar, we'll be discussing how the poultry industry can survive HPAI and what we can learn from this and past outbreaks. I would now like to introduce Dr. Carol Cardona. Dr. Cardona is a Pomeroy Chair in Avian Health for the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. She received her bachelor's degree from Hanover College and DVM from Purdue University. Dr. Cardona received her PhD from Michigan State University and did her postdoc work at Cornell. In addition to her expertise in avian influenza, Dr. Cardona is interested in infectious diseases that are transmitted between animals and humans and the role that poultry plays in human health, especially in developing countries. She also serves as co-principal investigator of the Minnesota Center of Excellence for Influenza Research and Surveillance at the university. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion, Dr. Cardona. The floor is now yours.
So today I'm going to talk to you about highly pathogenic avian influenza. And first we're going to talk about this year's outbreak, the 2022 outbreak. We're going to then talk about why do companies fail in an outbreak. So why do some companies go bankrupt? We're going to talk about the secure food system, which is something I work on here at the University of Minnesota, and something I always tell the folks here in Minnesota, which they get tired of, but learn during an outbreak. It will help you the next time. I know you're busy. I know you've got better things to do, but the best thing you can do in an outbreak is learn. So let's start out with the 2022 HPAI outbreak. By the end of the fall of 2021, here in the United States, we were looking out over the globe and seeing a lot of outbreaks in poultry across the world. We always look for those cases in Japan and in Korea because we know that most likely those came to those countries through the movement of wild birds. When those outbreaks begin to happen, we know that wild birds are carrying the goose Guangdong lineage H5 virus, and we think that that's a risk then for it to come over to the United States. The most common, or the previous time from 2015, it came over across the Bering Sea and up through Alaska and down into British Columbia, we think. More recently, in 2022, it's come across the Urals and into Europe, and then across the northern European states and into Canada, as we'll see. So in December 2021, we heard the news of a high-path avian influenza case on the Labrador Peninsula of Canada. And that raised our awareness that we had a new Eurasian virus in our hemisphere. So for birds, the world is divided. So North America has its own set of avian influenza viruses, homegrown, and the Eurasian continent has its own set of viruses that rarely intersect or rarely overlap in significant ways. So our protection from Eurasian viruses are really the two ponds, right? The two sides of the oceans that are around us. So suddenly we had this Eurasian virus. It had to have come to us either across the Bering Strait or through Greenland and Iceland from Europe. We knew that the location in eastern Canada likely meant it came across from Greenland and Iceland. The virus name tells us that it's HPAI, or highly pathogenic avian influenza. That tells us that it kills more than 80% of susceptible chickens that are infected with that virus. It doesn't tell us anything about what would happen in ducks or in geese or even in turkeys, but it tells us that in susceptible chickens, this virus is deadly. The virus is classified as an H5, so that's its hemagglutinin, one of the external genes, and that allows us to classify it within a genetic clade, so a family, if you will. And we found out that it was clade 2.3.4.4b. Wow, that's a mouthful, right? But the previous outbreak in 2015 was 2.3.4.4c. So we then knew that this virus was a sister or brother of that virus and might share some similarities. So back in December of 2021, here in Minnesota anyway, we got very excited and very concerned. So if we look back to 2015, in December of 2015, I drew this map and told everybody here in Minnesota that this virus was a danger. The 2015 virus was a danger to them, and that it was moving through wintering grounds, and we didn't really know where it was. At that time, it was appearing in wild birds, small flocks, and commercial flocks along the West Coast. So if we look back at 2015 and we look at today in 2022, there have been some similarities between the two outbreaks. We had the same farm infected twice in Minnesota. In 2015, it was infected on March 25th. This year was infected on March 29th. So clearly showing that the waves, there's a lot of similarity between how the viruses were moving. There are a lot of differences, however. So in 2015, one of the things that we learned was that we had to depopulate infected farms very quickly, or we would see lateral spread. So in 2015 in Minnesota, we had approximately 5 to 7 days from the first sample of a flock until it could be depopulated. In 2022, that time was reduced to 24 to 36 hours. In 2015, the sister virus caused neurological clinical signs in turkeys, but in 2022, there were limited neurological signs. In addition, we do environmental sampling in testing the drinkers, sometimes here in Minnesota, and we could see positives in advance of the tracheal sampling. That's likely because the virus was there for a longer period of time. So in other words, there was a longer preclinical time before the bird started dying in 2015. In contrast, in 2022, those drinker swabs were positive at the same time as tracheal swabs, and at the same time that mortality and clinical signs appeared, telling us that the birds were likely infected for a very short time before they began to die. Both independent and quite a bit of lateral transmission happened in 2015. So likely that's because we saw the independent exposures were likely occurring when there was contact with wild birds, and transmission happened from wild birds carrying the Hpai virus. In addition, there was a lot of lateral transmission. In other words, spread from farm to farm. That farm to farm spread was mostly eliminated in 2022. I think that's likely because of a couple of differences. The virus was different. In other words, it was killing the birds very rapidly, so we could see where the infections were. They were caught early, and in addition, we were doing a very good job with stamping out, so getting those flocks contained very quickly. So in 2015, we saw few wild bird cases and small flock involvement in the outbreak. There was some up in the northwest of the United States. In 2022, we saw a lot more wild bird and backyard involvement. And I think likely that's also a difference in the virus that we're seeing. So the virus that we've had in 2022 seems to have a broader host range. So for example, we've seen more chicken flocks infected with the with this virus. In fact, it's the first time we've seen broiler chickens, commercial broilers, get highly pathogenic avian influenza, telling us that they are susceptible to this virus, where in 2015, they appeared not to be. We had no broiler cases. I think that chicken susceptibility to the 2022 virus helps to explain the small flock involvement. Most people don't have turkeys in their backyard, but do have chickens instead. In 2015, cases were largely focused on Iowa and Minnesota in turkeys and in egg layers, and that likely has to do with the fact that we had so much lateral spread. So once the virus got into those types of systems, there was farm-to-farm spread. In 2022, instead, we've seen a large, broad distribution across states, which has really stressed response systems in all types of domesticated poultry. So far this year, as Kim stated, we've had approximately 40 million birds affected. But what did 2015 look like? So in 2015, we had 232 confirmed flocks. 211 of them were commercial, and 12 were small flocks or backyard flocks. So in contrast, we have a 50-50 split between commercial and small flocks in 2022. Again, I think that large number under commercial flocks in 2015 is a result of that lateral spread, or the spread from farm to farm. In contrast, in this year, we've had 36 affected states, broad geographic region. In 2015, only 14 states had cases. And in 2022, we've seen 40 million birds affected, and 50 million birds were affected in 2015. So can we say we're getting better? Maybe. This slide from Farm Bureau does a nice job, although it's quite out of date, from April 7th, showing kind of the distribution across species. Now, the interesting thing is, that you see that there's a lot of turkeys involved and layers involved in 2015. And proportionally many more backyards involved in 2022. So remember that there were no broilers in 2015 that were involved. And these are high path AI cases by flock type, thanks to the National Turkey Federation for providing this slide. Commercial turkeys represent a significant percentage of the cases that we've seen in 2022, and they were the overwhelming number of cases in 2015. So one of the questions you might ask is why? Why are commercial turkeys so involved? And it likely is related to the susceptibility of the species. So turkeys are particularly susceptible to infection with influenza viruses that are carried by ducks and aquatic waterfowl. For chickens, it takes a bit more virus to infect them, which makes them less susceptible and therefore less likely to be infected. So I think that helps to explain a little bit more about this case distribution. So another thing that we saw in 2022, and I think it's not something that we can really say about 2015. We had a hard time wrapping our arms around how the infection moved. We know that wild birds were involved in some way, but it appeared to be a much smaller number and we also didn't have backyard flocks involved. So, hats off to our folks at the Natural Resources departments. They have a daunting job to look at all the wild birds. And so I think, first of all, we haven't got the counts completed yet on what that looks like. And also, I'm not sure that we're ever going to have a comprehensive understanding of how things move through the United States. But what I've done here is I've taken the USDA data and applied it to just downloaded their map based on the prevalence or the numbers of cases in backyard flocks or small flocks by state. And so what I think you can see here is that as we move northwards, and this would have occurred, so the cases down south across the southern states in wild birds were mostly detected in December and January and a few in February. Then those birds began to move northward. And as they did, we lost track really of where the wild birds were moving. But if we consider that our small flocks are somehow sentinels out there, it helps us to understand perhaps what was going on. Sort of like looking at the footprints in the snow. There was something there because there are footprints there, but you can't really put your finger on what it exactly was. But as you move northward, we saw increasing numbers of small flock cases. And I think that helps us to understand that perhaps as those birds were moving northward, that the infection prevalence in those birds that were migrating together was increasing. And so as you move northward, you're beginning to see more exposure to those in those northern states. So I think it's a mistake to think that all of our southern friends have great biosecurity and all the northern flocks are not protected by biosecurity. So I think it's more likely that we've seen, these the migratory birds have gained in prevalence. What that means for the fall, I couldn't begin to tell you. So we've seen, sort of what happened in two particular outbreaks, 2015 and 2022. We've had some smaller outbreaks in between. But I think it's important to think about, an outbreak, a disease outbreak for a poultry company is a devastating experience. And you think, well, killing all of their birds, how can they possibly survive? Well, most of them do survive. But I think it's important to look at, when do they fail? What kinds of events cause them to fail? So let's step back and take a look at that for a minute. And then maybe that gives us some clues as to how to survive. So one of the things that can happen, of course, is a loss of market. And we see that other companies, in other sectors definitely lose business. Businesses go under because of loss of market. Consumers lose confidence in a product or company. And back in 2005 and 2006, we began to see this happening in Europe when this same family of viruses began to move into European poultry. In fact, the fear psychosis, they called it, devastated Italy's poultry sector, causing consumption to fall by 70%. And this was true across many European countries. If we look back a little further in developing countries, the same thing was happening. So you saw prices drop and consumption drop so significantly. However, if we pull this table out a little further, you can see that prices and consumption predominantly bounced back. And this is not something we predicted that it would happen in the US. We saw it happen in 2009 with pork products and influenza, but we haven't seen it with Hpai AI. So that's good news. So do poultry producing companies lose their businesses as a result of lost markets with high path AI? I say no at this time. This is not something that is a likely mechanism. So, another thing that happens is that producers can't meet demand. And so, they lose production because their flocks are infected, or they're depopulated because they're contact premises or something else, that they can't meet that demand, and someone else would step in and fill that. Alternatively, regulatory actions that stop the spread of the outbreak also stop movements. So of those two things, let's take a look at the largest foreign animal disease outbreak in US history, which happened in 2015. And, yes, we all lived through that. But if we look at, bankruptcies, again, from Farm Bureau, we don't really see a correlation with bankruptcies and the outbreak years or the post-outbreak years. So I think, in fact, we saw in Minnesota and Iowa that many companies actually made a lot of money right after the outbreak. So I'm going to suggest that the loss of, the infection itself or the loss of production isn't really a cause of bankruptcy. In other words, our indemnity and reimbursement programs are working pretty well. There is another one, though. These unintended consequences from regulatory actions that stop the movement of products and animals. This is the one that has caused businesses to go bankrupt time and time again in after outbreaks or during outbreaks. So in 1973, the turkey industry in Southern California never recovered from the velogenic Newcastle disease outbreak that preceded it. Most of them were not involved, but they couldn't survive the regulatory actions that were put in place. So if we think about what that might look like and the reasons for that, if we look at the egg production chain, we have our chickens producing eggs. Most of those eggs, many of them are going to go into a brief storage period before they appear in the markets. And those that egg, from the time it's laid till the time it's on the shelf in the market, is a very short period of time. A day, sometimes even less. And then it goes to the consumer. So this is called a just-in-time production chain, and each part is highly dependent on the preceding part and the part that follows. So what we see in a disrupted situation is that the first thing that happens is that if we can't move eggs, we suddenly overwhelm the storage facility. The storage facility for eggs is not built to hold more than 2 days worth of eggs. And the reason for that is we've built this just-in-time model. When you have too many eggs to store, the eggs are going to continue to be laid, but can't be moved. So this is a flock or a farm that has uninfected chickens, perfectly healthy chickens. So they're laying away and you have no place to put those. So what usually happens is you have to destroy product. There's no indemnity for product that has to be destroyed because your production chain has been destroyed. You can't supply your market, so you have empty shelves, and you might lose your market share. And a competitor who is not near an outbreak and doesn't have movement restrictions might be able to fill. So we found this has been going on for 2 decades, but it all started as an idea that the products from uninfected flocks in a control area, in an animal disease control area, could be moved to market without expanding an outbreak. So in the past, So in 2015 was the first time that really got used and tested. And we found out that those predetermined ways could be used, and they didn't spread the outbreak. So yay. So business continuity came to be, really. So business continuity is the development of protocols and tools to eliminate or minimize the unintended negative consequences of the disease and the disease response on agriculture and consumers, while also achieving the goals of disease control and response. So a lot of times people think, mistakenly, that there's a high path AI outbreak going on. So when we talk about business continuity in an area where there's an outbreak happening, that we're talking about moving infected birds or contaminated products. That's not it. We're talking about moving those products from uninfected birds and uninfected birds themselves. So the Secure Egg Supply Plan was the first of the secure supply plans to be done. So first, they identified risk pathways. How could the outbreak be spread if, for example, washed and sanitized eggs were moved to a market? We gathered a work group of people who worked in the industry, of state regulatory agents, and of federal regulators and academics to discuss and determine what could be done to reduce the risk of those various pathways. We then modeled the risk with the mitigations in place and wrote risk assessments. So let's go through this a bit. So in the first step, we need to define risk pathways. So if we take our example of washed and sanitized eggs, if you think about it, there could be highly pathogenic avian influenza virus on the inside of an egg laid by a flock if they're infected, but you haven't detected that infection yet. So they're infected at a very low level, and you move those eggs in your just-in-time model straight to market, right? Well, the way that we understand that is that if we hold or we mitigate that is the eggs are held for 2 days and the flock is tested before the eggs leave the processing plant. Before the eggs from 2 days ago leave the processing plant. So if we test on day 2, then we take a situation in which the risk is low, if we test the same day and move, and make it negligible by testing on that second day and moving days that are 2 days old. Because by day 2, that infection, if it were there, would have spread enough to enough chickens that we could detect it. So that's one part of the risk assessment and the risk mitigations. So for the whole example, we say high path the pathways could be inside the egg. Just went through how to mitigate that. High path AI could be contaminating packing materials. Okay, so you only use new pack to be able to move out of a control area, so that can't happen. High path AI could be on the outside of the egg and move on the egg shell. No, those eggs are washed and sanitized and overseen by the USDA itself. High path AI could move out of a control area on the truck or driver that is moving those eggs. Yes, that is a legitimate risk pathway. So that is the permit criteria for moving washed and sanitized eggs out of a control area. So in other words, the truck and driver have to undergo biosecurity that has to be assured by the mover of the eggs, so the company that owns those eggs. It has to be approved by the state that's moving the eggs. It has to be accepted by the state that's accepting those eggs, and then the movement can happen. So that's all based on what we call the secure food systems. It's a platform that uses public-private partnerships, right? So those work groups to determine mitigations. We develop proactive risk assessments. So in other words, before the outbreak happens, that guide risk-based continuity of business movements. There's a variety of secure food supply plans, some of them shown here. The big idea is that biosecurity or testing alone is not enough to release a hold order. Before an outbreak, we established those science-based strategies in which product from not known to be infected premises could be moved without spreading infection. So you say, oh, gosh, this doesn't make any sense. The secure food supply plans, why is that not the Red Book? Okay, so the Red Book is about foreign animal disease preparedness and response plans. Who is it targeted at? It's targeted towards infected farms. The secure food supply plans are targeted to uninfected farms. In 2015, we have in Minnesota, we had 100 farms that were infected. That means we had 900 farms that were not infected. So, it's somebody has to do something with those uninfected farms, or we have a lot of issues with food supply. So that's what the secure food supply plans do, is they address the needs of of uninfected farms. So the Red Book provides guidance to responders, and the secure food supply plans are a proactive approach to move animals and products. It's the ultimate is to make a partnership between state permitting authorities and private industry. When do you use the Red Book? Before, during, and after an FAD outbreak. When do you use secure food supply plans? When you're in a control area during an FAD outbreak. Why do you do the Red Book? To control and eradicate an FAD from the US. And the secure food supply plans is to not make things worse, to limit or prevent disease risk associated with specific movements. How do we use the Red Book? By outlining key outbreak response strategies, activities, and tools. It's a defined set of rules. How do we do it? How do we limit disease risk by movements? By using risk-based science to construct risk mitigation strategies. So two very different things that are happening at the same time in an outbreak. Our risk assessments, again, specifically address pathways of infection. So we outline how movement of the pathogen could happen from an uninfected farm to an uninfected farm through a specific movement. We then look at the potential pathways of transmission and the impact on those transmission pathways of mitigation strategies, and we assign a risk rating. When we determine overall risk, we group those pathways into local area spread pathways or people, vehicle, and equipment pathways. We then look at the mitigation strategies shown here. We have, the type of surveillance we would use, or an important strategy we call a pre-movement isolation period, sort of a pre-movement quarantine, if you will. So we prevent infection close to the time of the movement. We then look at things like loadout pathways and how those might contribute to risk. We do some mitigation measures for that, and then we get an overall risk for the total movement. So who develops risk assessment content? As I mentioned before, it's a group of people. And the groups all have different perspectives. Shown here is our cross-commodity work group. The ultimate or the final users of this work are going to be the poultry industry and the state. State governments are the permitting authorities, and the poultry industry are the movers of product. The federal regulatory agency provides pathways for sharing information through EMRS, but the determinants of what moves and how it moves are states and the industry. So the secure supply plans have been widely accepted in the US and widely used. We don't yet have the data on how much they have been used in 2022. But we know that the underlying concerns about moving product or animals into a control area where there is no infection is scary. But the risk assessments of the continuity of business plans provide a way to understand risk, even if you're not familiar with the activity. So broiler companies need to understand the risk of an egg production farm moving washed and sanitized eggs. And so by providing overall risk categories that everyone can agree to and understand, they can communicate about the appropriateness of those moves. So after we did all of that work in 2015, we finally got to use the plans, and we figured out that there were some things wrong. For every case, there are many non-case premises that will need or want to move product. To permit movements, it requires effort, both by the state and by the industry. And poultry guidance and permits were too detailed for regulators and honestly for the industry to use. We had too many, for example, we had too many different types of eggs. What's the difference between a hatching egg and a table egg? What's the difference between pasteurized egg and non-pasteurized egg? So a lot of details that really needed to be explained. And then we had differing permit guidances for similar or different products, and that caused confusion. So we needed to harmonize or pull those things together without causing increased risk. So what came out of that is that we decided that we needed to have an operational arm for the secure supply plan. So the science of the risk assessments are the basis for the permit guidances that are in the secure poultry supply plans. The permit guidance is the operational part of a risk assessment. A risk assessment may be hundreds of pages long. The permit guidance that comes from that, summarizing it and putting it into simple language, is going to be 1 to 5 pages long. So what do I need to do to mitigate risk when moving this product from a monitored premise to an approved location? You're going to look in the SPS permit guidance for that movement, and that's where you're going to get that information. We aren't going to make you scan the hundreds of pages of theory behind that. So permits guidances for product movements are available at Secure Poultry Supply, either .com or .umn.edu. First, step 1, monitored premises. So step back for a minute and let's think about what happens when there's an outbreak. Everybody's going along just fine, doing their just-in-time movements. Nobody's worried about anything. And suddenly there is an infected premises in your midst. Okay. So an infected premises means that there's evidence that highly pathogenic avian influenza is in that flock. Okay. Then we draw a control area around that. So there's a surveillance zone and a containment zone, et cetera. So in those zones, before anything's been determined, we call all of those at-risk premises. So if you're in a control area, you're an at-risk premises. If you're outside that control area, you're a free premises. So We find out that this black farm has just, yesterday traded birds with our infected premises. So that premises becomes a contact premises. They used to be called dangerous contact premises. I kind of like that name, but now they're called contact premises. And down here, when the incident command is calling around, they find out that this white farm down here, their birds have an unusual mortality rate. So clinical signs of Hpai pathogenic, that's a suspect premises. And then finally up here, we have something called a monitored premises. So monitored premises is a farm that is not infected, not a contact, not a suspect, and has negative PCR tests. And all of those things have to be established for the farm to be designated as a monitored premises. And product movement can happen from monitored premises. So that's an important part. So why do we do this? Well, this was a new concept. When there's a difference between the amount of virus that is on a farm that is known to be infected, in other words, where there's enough virus that it can be detected with our standard surveillance practices, and a monitored premises where we can't find the infection, we have no clinical signs, haven't had a dangerous contact, and they have a negative PCR test. The next step, so now that you're a monitored premises, you have to find your permit guidances. The permit guidances can be found at this website. You can look for that permit guidance by the class of thing you're going to move, or you can search by species. All gets you to the same place. This is the chickens. If you want to move broilers, or if you want to move egg layers, they would be different locations. And finally, you'll click on this, like the day-old birds, broiler day-old chicks. If you click on that, you'll get something that looks like this page down here under Understanding the Permit Guidance. And it'll tell you what needs to get done and how to do it. And then down at the bottom of the page, you'll see these secure poultry plans. And that's where you can find the hundreds of pages of material to figure out why we said what you had to do was what you have to do. The third step is your state of origin will enter or check the data that you have entered into EMRS, the Secure Transmission Portal, and accept the permit request. This means you then have a pending permit. So you've requested that you can move your washed and sanitized eggs to Carol's distribution center. So once that permit request is in, the state permitting authority will add a permit number and issue an expiration date and approve or disapprove that permit request. If it's approved, you then have a permit or permission to move. Once that permission to move happens, you are free to move your product from a control area as long as you continue to maintain your monitored premises status and fulfill your permit criteria. And then you will enter where that movement happened and when. So you will track that movement after it happens. So the secure food supply plans are definitely a partnership. The industry is the only one who can know how to do all of the permit guidance criteria. They have to assure that all that guidance criteria is met. They have to know the details of the engine. When the engine breaks down, they have to be able to rebuild it and keep the car on the road. And state animal health officials have to see that appropriate assurances have been made. They have to drive that car, but they don't necessarily have to understand the entire engine. So we, in conclusion here, we learned and applied a lot of lessons from 2015. Stamping out works when applied correctly. So we shortened our stamping out, our depopulation times, and it helped a lot. And we were able to prevent subsequent farm-to-farm spread by doing that. Preparing for the last outbreak helped us with this outbreak. The next outbreak, we have no idea what that's going to look like. We kind of need to learn some lessons from 2022. The Secure Poultry Supply Plan helped poultry companies stay in business during an outbreak. It's not easy to move things following Secure Poultry Supply Plan methods, but it does prevent the spread of infection. So I'll ask you, what are the lessons of 2022?
Well, thank you, Carol. And before we get started answering questions, which this will be a big one, I'm sure, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation. Organic trace minerals come in many types and formulations, leading to confusion about chemistry, terminology, and methodologies. With Balchem's Keysure line of chelated minerals, we provide superior performance and exceptional value by keeping it simple. Binding minerals to the highest quality plant protein-derived amino acids and peptides in our world-class production facilities, using a true chelation process pioneered by Balchem and trusted in both the human and animal arenas for nearly 60 years. The Keysure line delivers proven and consistent bioavailability to maximize performance, and a no-frills pricing approach for greater profitability. Visit balchemanh.com to see how Keysure chelated minerals are your link to superior performance and exceptional value. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. Dr. Cardona, your first question is, it comes from Jim. Why do you think we saw such mortality in wild waterfowl this year, as well as huge outbreaks in commercial ducks in Indiana and Pennsylvania compared to previous years?
So we know for many, many years that Hpai viruses differ in the types of mortality and clinical signs they can cause in wild water and domesticated waterfowl. So I'm going to have to throw up my hands and say I don't know the mechanism, but I think that, this is an established fact. So if you remember back to 2005, we saw large die-offs of bar-headed geese at Qinghai Lake in China. That was the first time that, the flu world was alerted to the fact that waterfowl could experience the clinical signs of Hpai. We saw that some species of waterfowl this year did experience mortality. It appears that snow geese, Canada geese, black ducks experience mortality, but that the dabbling ducks, the mallards, and the teals, not so much, so it's hard to say why. We also saw previously that swans were particularly susceptible to Hpai. So I think it's a feature of the virus, but it's unclear as to what those features might be.
Okay. Next question. Do you see a time when AI vaccines will be used, and what are the benefits and drawbacks to a vaccine?
So I definitely see a time when AI vaccines will be used. And I think that a vaccine is simply a tool that we have to use against a virus. And the downsides of using vaccines at this time in the United States and really anywhere across the globe are that they cause trade impacts. So there are many countries that won't accept poultry from a country or poultry products from a country that is vaccinating. That's simply something that we're going to have to get over. Because I think globally, this particular clade of viruses, this H5 group of viruses, is so dangerous that we need every tool that we have. And I think that by having vaccine in our tool belt is a definite advantage. And we simply need to make sure that the trade impacts don't happen, because all countries are understanding where vaccination is used, how it's being monitored, making sure that it doesn't spread infection to other species, and making sure that it's not creating a more dangerous situation.
Right, right. Your next question is, what's the typical range of lateral spread of HPAI observed in the field?
So we usually use, for our models, we usually use, I'm not 100% sure what the question is. I'll answer part of it and you can resubmit. But we usually think of lateral spread as something that would happen between, say, you and your, maybe a high farm to farm spread would be, say, 4. So one of our modelers created, named Peter Bonney, very talented young man, created a transmission kernel model. And I think 3.5 farms from a single farm based on its distance to another farm and its centrality in its location would be a big number. So one farm maybe infects up to 3 to 4 farms.
Okay. Your next question comes in from Carrie. Is there an opportunity to impact HPAI spread by treating or managing the virus in the wild bird populations? And what would that be?
So I think so. So one of the things that we've seen is, but I don't think that we have the tools to do that at this time. So is it, and I think some of that is going to happen naturally. So I mentioned that we didn't know what would happen in the fall, but I think we kind of know what happened in the spring. In the spring, we had almost every wild bird in North America was susceptible to infection. They all got infected at various time points, or some large percentage of them. A large percentage of them moved northward to breeding grounds, and a large percentage of those who survive are going to develop antibodies and are not going to have infection on the way down. So I think we know what happened on the way up. It's hard to say what will happen on the way down, but I do think there is a natural treatment, if you will, and that's the immune response that's going to happen post-infection. So it'll be interesting to see.
Got it. Now here's your lessons from 2022 question. I know all the data isn't in yet, but what are the lessons you see from 2022 that can be employed for future outbreaks?
So I think that I think some of the lessons of 2015 still haven't been learned and could be applied in 2022. For example, we know that the poultry industry stepped up to in a dramatic way to help in response. We've known that happens, that's important, that they have equipment, they have experience, and they have trained personnel to do those kinds of things. But we've always had a more rigid approach, saying that, the USDA is going to do this, or the state is responsible for doing this. And I think we saw here that in order to reach those goals, and because the response was spread across so many states, that the industry really had to step into a much greater level. So I think one of the lessons learned is that could be a good thing. And that if that, so I think that a lesson maybe implemented would be to better understand what resources they needed, what information they needed, what went well on their side, what went well in that coordination between the states and the industry and the USDA. So I think that's something that happened well, but I think we could miss it if we don't really step back and evaluate it.
Okay. So here's an interesting question. So this may be outside of your area, but do you think an outbreak of African swine fever in the U.S. is imminent? And should the same strategies be employed for that?
Well, I think there's a lot of people on our team that are actually working on African swine fever and doing the same types of things. I think this approach is really, really helpful. It's not always right, but it's always helpful. And I think that that is something that would be very important for African swine fever. Do I think that it's imminent in the United States? I can't begin to say. I know that it's very close to the United States. And I think that there's other diseases that may come along and surprise the swine industry. So I'm going to turn it around and say, is African swine fever going to come to the United States? Is it a foregone conclusion? I have no idea, but something will come. Some foreign animal disease will come to the swine industry. You know, it's sort of like asking if there is going to be a flu pandemic, you know, and now we've had SARS-CoV. So yes, someday there'll be a flu pandemic. As long as you've got susceptible animals, something will come along.
Right, right. Next question comes in from Mohammed. What is the level of cooperation between Canada and Mexico with us to help conduct surveillance in wild birds?
So the Canadians, we have great cooperation, but we are the big engine of doing most of the wild bird surveillance. In Mexico, same thing. They just don't. Wild bird surveillance is incredibly difficult to do. And so, and it's also very difficult to interpret. So we have to step back and say, you know, we found this virus or that virus in this species, in this location, and we're stuck with what does it mean? So for example, in 2016, Hpai AI 2.3.4.4c was detected in wild birds in the United States. It didn't appear to mean much. Right now, I think there are detections that are happening in small flocks across the United States. They're going to pop up every once in a while. There'll be some wild bird detections over the summer. I think that it doesn't mean that it's at the load that would cross a biosecurity line and make it into a commercial poultry outbreak, a perpetuated outbreak. So, you know, I guess, yes, we have great cooperation, but I'm not sure what it means. I do think there's some important studies that have been going on for a very long time. You know, I think our friends at USGS and USDA have done a really, really good job of thinking proactively about what does this piece of the puzzle, what could this piece of the puzzle mean? So a good friend and collaborator, Jeff Hall, has done a lot of work with sea ducks, you know, and looking at sea ducks moving influenza viruses between Europe and North America. Well, that's very important work and likely very timely. In the same strain, there's a lot of people that have done a lot of work for a lot of years, you know, up in Alaska, doing really important discovery work that just haven't been involved in detecting that right virus yet. So, you know, I'm not sure that wild bird detection is really, the poultry industry shouldn't rely on it as an early warning. We need to continue to do it to better understand where the viruses are moving, how they're moving, and how we can mitigate those bigger global shifts and moves. But those are years-long effort. And the poultry industry needs information about this fall, 3 months from now, right?
Sure, sure. Well, we have reached the top of the hour, so we will close with one last question that comes from Kenneth. The incidence of outbreaks in backyard poultry is 9 times greater than in 2014-15. Several countries mandated that all outdoor poultry be brought inside. APHIS did not implement mandatory policy, but did urge farmers to bring birds indoors. Would you support an effort to mandate bringing poultry indoors during an outbreak?
I think, you know, I'm not sure that the complete indoors is the step that's needed. I think what we've understood is that we have to discourage wild birds from coming near your flocks. Okay. If you can put them indoors, great. If you cannot, you need to, for sure, feed them indoors. You need to lock up their feed. You need to not attract wild birds to your facility. You need to, if you have a pond, you need to fence it off. If you can, cover your chicken yard with netting to keep wild birds out. When do wild birds come to visit chicken yards? Well, they're not going to fight the chickens usually. So they come at night. If you put up cameras, you can see them coming at night and feeding around. So I think figuring out how to contain those birds is important. The most critical steps are keeping them away from the wild birds. So, yep, I think we haven't I don't think that the resultant numbers are because people didn't have them indoors or weren't keeping them indoors. We saw lots of commercial farms that broke that did have their poultry indoors. So I think it's a little more complicated than just, putting them indoors. It's about a whole culture of thinking about separating your domestic poultry from wild birds. So making sure that your feed is indoors, you're sweeping it up, covering the spaces that they're in so that they're not connecting with that places that wild birds have been.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cardona, for all of your insight and all of your help. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science Lecture Series of webinars will be taking a summer break in July, but we'll be back in August to continue the conversations. Join us on Tuesday, August 16th, as Dr. Joe Pagan, President and Founder of the Kentucky Equine Research, presents recent developments in performance horse health and nutrition. Visit balchem.com/realscience for more details and to register for all future webinars. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform or visit balchem.com/podcast. We're closing in on our 50th episode, so there's a wonderful library of topics to choose from. Subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address, and we'll send you a cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Cardona, thank you for joining us today.